The most dangerous men aren't the ones who hear the word no. They're the ones who've forgotten it exists. The rain tapped softly against the classroom windows as I stacked construction paper into neat piles and tried to ignore the ache in my feet. It was nearly 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and most of the teachers had already gone home. The hallways of Jefferson Elementary were quiet now, emptied of laughter, backpacks, and the constant energy that came with 200 children under one roof. I liked it this way. The silence felt earned. A reward after another long day. I glanced at the family photo one of my students had drawn and left on my desk that morning. The stick figures were uneven, the colors spilled outside the lines, and somehow it was still more honest than most things adults created. I smiled as I slipped it into my bag. That was when I heard raised voices outside. At first, I ignored them. Parents occasionally argued in the parking lot. Life happened. But then I heard a child crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically, just enough to make my stomach tighten. I stood and walked toward the front entrance. Through the glass doors, I spotted little Noah Parker sitting on a bench near the curb, his shoulders hunched beneath an oversized blue jacket. 10 years old. Smart. Quiet. The kind of kid who apologized when someone else bumped into him. Standing nearby were two men in dark suits. One of them spoke into an earpiece while the other checked his watch with obvious impatience. A black SUV idled at the curb. Noah looked terrified. I pushed open the door and stepped outside. Cold air brushed against my face. "Is everything okay?" I asked. Both men turned toward me. The taller one offered a professional smile that never reached his eyes. "School business is finished, ma'am. We're handling a private family matter." Noah immediately looked at me. That look said everything. He wasn't okay. "Noah," I asked gently, "do you know these men?" His small fingers tightened around his backpack strap. Before he could answer, the second man stepped forward. "We're here to escort him." Escort. Not pick up. Not help. Escort. Something about that word felt wrong. "I'll need confirmation from a legal guardian before any student leaves with someone unfamiliar," I said. "School policy." The taller man's smile disappeared. "Miss Carter, I assure you everything is authorized." The fact that he knew my name should have made me feel better. Somehow it didn't. "Then you won't mind waiting while I make a phone call." Neither man moved. Neither man smiled. The rain continued to fall in soft silver lines beneath the parking lot lights. Then another vehicle pulled in. This one wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The entire atmosphere shifted the moment it arrived. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop beside the SUV. The driver stepped out first. Then another man. Then him. I didn't know his name yet. I only knew that every person around him seemed to straighten instinctively. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His dark hair was neatly styled despite the weather. But it was his eyes that caught me. Calm. Focused. The eyes of a man accustomed to being listened to. He glanced at Noah, then at the men beside him, then finally at me. "What's the delay?" he asked. His voice was low and controlled. One of the men answered immediately. "The teacher is refusing to release the child." The stranger looked at me for a moment. Not annoyed. Not angry. Simply surprised. As if those words rarely applied to him. I folded my arms. "I'm not refusing anything. I'm protecting one of my students." A faint silence settled over the parking lot. The rain seemed louder somehow. The man studied me carefully. Then his gaze shifted toward Noah, whose face had gone pale. "You're Emily Carter," he said. It wasn't a question. "And you are?" I replied. Another silence. One of the men beside him looked genuinely shocked that I'd asked. The stranger's expression changed slightly. Not quite a smile. Not quite amusement. Something else. Something curious. Damian Moretti. The name meant nothing to me. At least not yet. "Well, Mr. Moretti," I said, meeting his gaze without blinking. "Until I speak with Noah's guardian, he isn't going anywhere." For the first time in a very long time, a room full of powerful people had gone completely silent because someone had told Damian Moretti no. And I had no idea that single word was about to change both of our lives forever. The rain had stopped by the time Noah's mother arrived, but the tension in the parking lot lingered like the last rumble of a distant storm. I watched as she rushed toward her son, wrapping him in a hug so tight that his backpack nearly slipped from his shoulders. Relief softened the fear in his eyes almost instantly. That alone told me I had made the right decision. Damian Moretti stood a few feet away with his hands in the pockets of his coat, saying nothing. His men remained silent too. The entire situation ended with a simple misunderstanding involving a family trust and legal guardianship paperwork that had not yet been updated at the school. At least that was the explanation I received. Maybe it was true. Maybe it was not. Either way, Noah left safely with his mother, and that was all that mattered to me. I expected Damien and his entourage to leave immediately afterward. Instead, he remained standing beside the curb while the parking lot gradually emptied around us. The cold evening air brushed against my cheeks as I adjusted the strap of my bag. "You embarrassed my security team tonight," he said finally. His tone was calm, almost conversational. I frowned. I protected a student. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Most people become nervous around me. Maybe they should spend less time worrying about you and more time following school procedures." One of the men behind him shifted uncomfortably. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Damien's expression remained unreadable. For a moment, he simply studied me, the way someone might study a puzzle that refused to fit together. "You did not know who I was. Should I?" Another pause. I could practically hear the disbelief from the men standing nearby. Damien glanced toward the school building, then back at me. "No, perhaps that is exactly the problem." Before I could respond, he nodded once and turned away. Within seconds, the vehicles disappeared into the night, leaving me alone beneath the parking lot lights. I should have forgotten about him after that. Instead, I found myself thinking about the encounter during my drive home. My apartment sat above a small bakery on the edge of Queens. Nothing fancy. 2 rooms. Old hardwood floors. A radiator that hissed all winter long. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the walls every morning. I loved it. As I unlocked my door, I caught myself wondering why a man like Damien Moretti had looked genuinely surprised when someone challenged him. The thought bothered me more than it should have. The next morning, life returned to normal. Spelling quizzes, science projects, lunch duty. The familiar rhythm of teaching settled around me like a comfortable blanket. By noon, I had nearly forgotten the entire thing. Then the delivery arrived. The receptionist appeared at my classroom door holding an envelope. "This was left for you." I accepted it carefully. There was no return address, no stamp, just my name written in neat black lettering. Inside was a single card. "Thank you for protecting Noah." Along with the note came a donation receipt. $50,000 directed to the school's after-school reading program. My eyes widened. The reading program had spent months trying to raise enough money for new materials. We had bake sales, fundraisers, parent drives, and now someone had donated the entire amount in one afternoon. I immediately knew who had sent it. The card contained no signature, but it did not need one. My stomach tightened. Around me, children continued working on math worksheets, completely unaware that someone had just changed the future of dozens of students with the stroke of a pen. I looked out the classroom window toward the street below. A black sedan sat parked across from the school. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it belonged to someone else entirely. But as sunlight reflected briefly across the windshield, a strange feeling settled in my chest. Something told me that Damien Moretti was not used to hearing the word no. Something else told me he was not planning to forget the woman who had said it. The first snow of December arrived 3 weeks later, dusting the sidewalks of Queens in a thin layer of white that disappeared almost as quickly as it fell. I stood at the corner crosswalk outside Jefferson Elementary with a cup of coffee warming my hands, watching parents hurry their children toward the entrance. The city felt softer in the snow, quieter. For a few minutes, it almost seemed peaceful. Then I noticed the black sedan again. It sat across the street exactly where it had been several times over the past few weeks. Never too close. Never doing anything suspicious. Just there. The first time I saw it, I dismissed it. The second time, I paid attention. By the 5th or 6th appearance, it was impossible to ignore. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was not. I walked into the school and tried to focus on my day. Fractions, reading groups, a classroom science experiment involving vinegar and baking soda. The normal chaos of teaching kept my mind occupied until lunch. That was when Principal Henderson appeared in my doorway, looking unusually excited. "Emily, do you have a minute?" I followed her into the hallway. "What happened?" She handed me a folder thick enough to stop a door. This happened. Inside were documents, proposals, and letters. My eyes widened as I flipped through them. A technology grant, new computers, updated classroom equipment, scholarship funds for low-income students. educational resources that our district had been requesting for years. Where did this come from? I asked. The principal smiled. Anonymous donor. I closed the folder slowly. Anonymous. Very anonymous. Her smile grew wider. Whoever it is seems particularly interested in helping this school. I already knew. Nobody said his name. Nobody needed to. Later that afternoon, I found myself staring out the classroom window again. The black sedan remained parked across the street. A strange mixture of irritation and curiosity settled in my chest. I did not understand him. Wealthy people donated money all the time. Usually they wanted recognition. A building named after them. Their photograph in a newsletter. A speech. A plaque. Damien Moretti wanted none of those things. That confused me more than if he had simply been arrogant. The following Saturday, I volunteered at a community center a few blocks from my apartment. Every month, we organized a reading program for local families. Nothing glamorous. Folding chairs. Donated books. Free hot chocolate. The kind of event that survived entirely because ordinary people cared enough to show up. I was arranging children's books when the room suddenly grew quieter. Not silent. Just different. The way a room changes when someone unexpected walks through the door. I looked up. Damien stood near the entrance wearing a dark wool coat and a simple gray sweater. No security detail. No expensive entourage. Just him. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining things. Then our eyes met. What are you doing here? I asked. His gaze moved around the room. Children reading. Parents talking. Volunteers setting up tables. Observing. That sounds suspicious. To my surprise, he laughed softly. The sound caught me completely off guard. Everything sounds suspicious when you say it. I folded my arms. You have been sending donations. The school needed help. And watching my school, his expression shifted slightly. Not defensive. Not guilty. Simply honest. I was curious. I stared at him. Most powerful men spent their lives trying to hide the truth. Damien had just admitted it without hesitation. Curious. As if I were some mystery he could not solve. Across the room, a little girl ran up holding a picture book almost as large as she was. Miss Carter, can you read this one? She asked. I smiled immediately. Of course. When I turned back, Damien was still standing there. Watching. Not me this time. The children. The volunteers. The ordinary people moving through an ordinary afternoon. And for the first time, I noticed something unexpected in his eyes. Not power. Not authority. Loneliness. The kind that no amount of money could ever fix. And somehow that realization felt far more dangerous than the black sedan ever had. The scent of cinnamon and hot chocolate lingered in the community center long after most of the families had gone home. Volunteers folded tables, while children carried stacks of books back to the shelves. Outside, the winter sky had already turned dark, and snow drifted past the windows in slow, lazy spirals. I watched a little boy wave goodbye before running toward his mother, and when I turned back, Damien was still standing exactly where I had left him. It was strange. Men like him were always moving, always occupied. Yet somehow he looked more comfortable in this crowded room than he had in any expensive car or tailored coat. You can stop staring, I said as I stacked picture books into a box. I am helping. Watching is not helping. Without a word, he reached down and lifted 3 heavy boxes at once. My eyes narrowed. Show off. A faint smile appeared. Teacher. I hated how amused I felt. Over the next hour he stayed. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because cameras were present. He carried supplies, cleaned tables, and even listened patiently while an elderly volunteer explained the history of the building for nearly 20 minutes. Most wealthy donors would have escaped after 30 seconds. Damien listened to every word. On Monday morning, I arrived at school expecting life to return to normal. Instead, I found construction crews unloading equipment outside the gymnasium. Teachers gathered in the parking lot wearing expressions of complete confusion. Principal Henderson practically ran toward me. You are not going to believe this. She handed me another folder. New gym equipment. Renovated classrooms. Updated heating systems. Educational grants. My stomach sank. No. The principal blinked. No. Please tell me this is not another anonymous donor. Her smile answered before her words did. I closed my eyes. By lunchtime, I was standing inside a downtown office tower that looked more like a luxury hotel than a workplace. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan. Marble floors reflected the city lights. Everything felt polished, expensive, and completely disconnected from the world I knew. A receptionist led me toward a private office larger than my entire apartment. Damien stood near the window when I entered. He turned as the door closed behind me. "Emily, you need to stop." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Good afternoon to you too." I placed the folder on his desk. "This." He glanced down. "The school appreciates it. That is not the point." "Then explain the point." Frustration tightened in my chest. "You cannot solve every problem with money." Silence settled between us. The city skyline glowed behind him like a painting. Damien studied me carefully before speaking. "Most people disagree with that statement. Most people are wrong." To my surprise, he did not argue. Instead, he walked to the coffee station and poured 2 cups. "Why does this bother you?" he asked. "Because children need people who care about them, not people who throw money at them and disappear." Something shifted in his expression. Small, almost invisible, yet I saw it. "And if someone stays?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. The question felt more personal than it should have. "Then that matters." Damien looked down at the coffee cup in his hand. For the first time since I met him, he seemed uncertain. Not weak, not nervous, just thoughtful. Like a man hearing an answer he had been searching for longer than he wanted to admit. When I finally left the building, snow was falling again. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I glanced back through the glass. Damien still stood by the window watching the city below, surrounded by everything money could buy, yet somehow looking like he was trying to understand something far more valuable. The wind cut sharply between the buildings as January settled over New York, carrying that particular kind of cold that seemed to slip through every layer of clothing no matter how carefully you dressed. I pulled my coat tighter as I walked toward Jefferson Elementary before sunrise, balancing a travel mug in one hand and a stack of graded papers in the other. The streets were still quiet. Most of the city had not fully woken up yet. I liked these moments. They reminded me that life did not need to be loud to be meaningful. By the time classes ended that afternoon, I had completely forgotten about Damien Moretti and his endless attempts to improve the world through financial miracles. Then I walked into my apartment building and nearly dropped my keys. A moving crew stood in the hallway carrying furniture. Expensive furniture. Brand new furniture. One man smiled when he saw me. "Miss Carter." My stomach immediately tightened. "No." The smile faded slightly. "We have a delivery scheduled for your apartment." "No, you do not." He checked a clipboard. A dining table, living room set, kitchen appliances, and several additional items. I closed my eyes. Of course it was him. 20 minutes later, I stood inside Damien's office for the second time that month. Snow drifted beyond the enormous windows while the city glowed beneath a gray winter sky. Damien looked up from a document as I entered. "You seem unhappy." "There are people carrying furniture into my apartment." That would explain it. I stared at him. "You bought furniture. Your couch was held together by hope and determination. You have been inside my apartment?" "No." "Then how do you know?" A brief pause. "You mentioned it." I hated that he was right. Several weeks earlier, I had jokingly complained about my ancient couch during a conversation at the community center. Apparently, he remembered everything. "You cannot do things like this." "Why?" "Because normal people do not buy furniture for teachers." He leaned back slightly. "Perhaps I am not normal." That answer should not have made me laugh. Unfortunately, it did. I quickly stopped. "Take it back." "No." "Damien." "Emily." The way he said my name carried a frustrating amount of patience. Like he already knew how the conversation would end. I folded my arms. "Why are you doing this?" For the first time, he did not answer immediately. The silence stretched between us. Beyond the glass, snowflakes drifted slowly over Manhattan. Finally he spoke. "Because when I see a problem, I fix it. People are not problems." His eyes met mine. Calm, focused, honest. I know. Something about the way he said it made my heartbeat stumble. Not because it sounded romantic. Because it sounded sincere. There was a difference. I took a slow breath. The school donations were generous. The reading program helped children. The community center needed support. But this. I shook my head. This is different. Damien listened without interrupting. "I do not want gifts. Most people would. I am not most people." A faint smile touched his face. "That is becoming very clear." I reached into my bag and placed a small envelope on his desk. He glanced down. Inside was a check returning every dollar he had spent on my apartment. Not because I could afford it. I could not. It represented nearly all of my savings. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "A boundary." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Damien looked at the check, looked at me, and slowly nodded. Not angry, not offended, just thoughtful, as if I had handed him something far more valuable than money. And when I walked out of his office that afternoon, I did not see disappointment in his eyes. I saw respect, which somehow felt much more dangerous. Rain tapped against the classroom windows as I finished grading essays long after the last student had gone home. The building was quiet except for the occasional hum of the heating system. Outside, the sky had already darkened into shades of gray and blue, and the parking lot lights reflected across the wet pavement. I was gathering papers when a soft knock sounded at my door. Mrs. Ramirez stood in the hallway holding the hand of her grandson, Ethan. I recognized him immediately. 3rd grade. Bright smile. Loved astronomy. Usually. Tonight, he looked exhausted. "Miss Carter, do you have a minute?" she asked. Something in her voice made my stomach tighten. We sat together inside the classroom while Ethan quietly worked on a coloring sheet. Mrs. Ramirez explained that the apartment building where they had lived for nearly 15 years was being sold. Rent was increasing beyond what most families could afford. Several residents had already moved away. Others would soon follow. "We do not know where we are going," she admitted, her eyes shining with worry. "Ethan may need to transfer schools." Ethan kept coloring without looking up. That somehow made it worse. Children should not have to carry adult fears. After they left, I sat alone at my desk staring at the empty classroom. Ethan was not the first student facing this problem. Over the past year, several families had disappeared from the neighborhood. New luxury developments had replaced older buildings. Small businesses had closed. Communities that had existed for decades were vanishing. I thought about it all night. The next afternoon, I attended a fundraising event for local education programs. I almost declined the invitation until I learned several major city developers would be present. The ballroom overlooked the river, glittering with expensive suits and polished smiles. Everything about it felt artificial. Then I saw Damien. He stood across the room speaking with a group of executives. As always, people listened carefully whenever he spoke. His eyes found mine almost immediately. I hated that my pulse reacted. "Emily." His voice carried warmth as he approached. "You look like you have questions." "I do." I glanced toward a large presentation screen displaying upcoming development projects throughout the city. One company logo appeared repeatedly beside several projects. Moretti Urban Holdings. My chest tightened. Those apartment buildings being redeveloped in Queens. His expression remained calm. "What about them?" "Families are being displaced." Silence. The noise of the ballroom faded into the background. "Emily, one of my students may lose his home." His eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. In concern. "I did not know that." "They are your projects." The words came out sharper than I intended. Damien looked toward the presentation screen. For the first time since I met him, uncertainty crossed his face. Real uncertainty. "I oversee hundreds of investments." "Then maybe that is the problem." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Around us, conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed. Yet neither of us seemed to hear any of it. Damien stared at the screen displaying profits, growth projections, and expansion plans. Numbers. Percentages. Success. Then something changed in his expression. Slowly. Painfully. Like a man realizing he had missed something important. "What building?" he asked quietly. I told him. He said nothing for several seconds. "I will look into it. Do not fix it because it matters to me." His gaze lifted to mine. "Then why should I fix it?" I swallowed hard. "Because they matter." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Damien looked back, toward the presentation, and for the first time since I had known him, he no longer seemed proud of what he was seeing. The city looked washed clean after 3 straight days of rain, but nothing inside me felt clear. 1 week had passed since the fundraiser. 1 week since I had watched something change behind Damien's eyes. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself he was simply another wealthy man discovering consequences that ordinary people lived with every day. Yet somehow I kept thinking about him. That should have been my warning. Trouble rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as hope. On Friday afternoon, Ethan Ramirez did not come to school. Neither did 2 other students from the same apartment complex. By Monday, 4 desks sat empty. The classroom felt wrong without them. Children notice absence differently than adults do. They do not hide it behind polite conversation. They simply ask questions nobody can answer. "When is Ethan coming back?" one student asked. I did not know. The answer sat heavily in my chest all day. After school, I drove to the neighborhood where Ethan lived, or had lived. Moving trucks lined the street. Storefront windows stood empty. Familiar signs had disappeared. The bakery where several families gathered every Saturday morning was closed. A handwritten notice hung in the window. "Thank you for 23 wonderful years." I sat in my car staring at it long after the engine stopped. Something broke inside me then. Not dramatically, quietly, like a thread finally snapping after being pulled too tight for too long. That evening, I found myself standing outside Damien's office building. I had not called ahead. I had not planned what to say. I simply needed answers. 20 minutes later, I stood inside his office while the lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls. Damien looked genuinely surprised to see me. "Emily." I did not sit down. "How many?" His brow furrowed. "How many what? How many families?" Silence. I already knew the answer from the way his expression changed. "Emily, how many people lost homes because of those projects?" His jaw tightened slightly. Not defensive. Regretful. Somehow that made it worse. "I have spent the last week reviewing everything." That is not an answer. He looked away first. The movement was small, but it felt enormous. More than I realized. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm, too quiet. I laughed once. A hollow sound I barely recognized. "Of course. I am trying to fix it. After the damage is done." His face paled. I had never seen him look hurt before. Not truly hurt. But there it was. Clear as daylight. The problem was that it no longer mattered. I thought about Ethan. About the bakery. About empty desks. About all the people who never got invited into rooms like this one. People who lived with decisions made by strangers staring at spreadsheets. "I was wrong about you," I said softly. Damien froze. The city lights reflected across the glass behind him. "Emily." Just my name. Nothing else. No defense. No excuse. Somehow that hurt too. I picked up my coat. "Do not contact me again." The silence that followed seemed to swallow the entire room. For the first time since we met, Damien Moretti looked completely powerless. But I could not stay and watch. Because the most painful part was not discovering who he had been. It was realizing I had started believing he could become someone else. Spring arrived quietly that year. The snow disappeared. Trees along the sidewalks began to bloom. Children traded winter coats for lighter jackets. And life moved forward the way it always does, whether hearts are ready or not. I threw myself into work because it was easier than thinking. Easier than remembering a man standing alone in an office full of glass and regret. Weeks became months. Then summer arrived. One afternoon, Principal Henderson rushed into my classroom carrying a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she asked breathlessly. I looked down. The headline featured a major housing initiative launching across several neighborhoods. Affordable apartments. Long-term rent protections. Community business grants. Educational funding. The article mentioned dozens of projects already underway. What caught my attention was the final sentence. The entire program had been funded privately through the Moretti Foundation. I stared at the page for a long moment. "Interesting," I said quietly. "That is all you have to say?" I folded the paper and handed it back. People can write checks. But that was not all he had done. Over the following months, I noticed things. Families who had been displaced returned to renovated apartments with affordable leases. Small businesses reopened. Community centers expanded. Scholarship programs appeared throughout the city. Whenever reporters asked for interviews, the foundation declined. Whenever news organizations requested photographs, none were provided. There were no speeches, no ribbon cuttings, no publicity campaigns, just results. Real results. One Saturday afternoon, I volunteered at the community center again. The same room, the same folding chairs, the same shelves filled with donated books. A new reading wing had been added since my last visit. Children filled every corner. Laughter echoed off the walls. I stood watching them when an elderly volunteer approached me. "You know who paid for all this, right?" she asked. I nodded. "I can guess." She smiled. "Funny thing." "What?" "He comes here sometimes." My heart skipped unexpectedly. "Who?" "The donor." She pointed toward a photograph wall covered with children's artwork. "Never tells anyone who he is. Just sits and listens." I looked away before she could notice my expression. Later that evening, After everyone had gone home, I walked through the neighborhood alone. Families filled the sidewalks. Restaurants buzzed with conversation. Storefronts glowed beneath the setting sun. Places that had once stood empty were alive again. The changes were impossible to ignore. Yet what stayed with me most was not what Damien had built. It was what he had stopped doing. He no longer appeared outside my school. No black sedans. No surprise donations connected to me. No gifts. No attempts to convince me. He had respected the boundary I asked for. Completely. Somehow that hurt more than if he had argued. Because for the first time, everything he was doing seemed to have nothing to do with winning me over. It felt like he was finally becoming the man he wanted to be. The realization followed me home that night. Long after the city lights faded beyond my apartment window. Long after the streets grew quiet. And for the first time in nearly a year, I found myself wondering not whether Damien Moretti had changed. I found myself wondering how much it had cost him to do it. The air carried the first hint of autumn when I saw him again. Nearly a year had passed since I walked out of his office and asked him to stay out of my life. A year of classrooms, lesson plans, parent conferences, and ordinary days that somehow never felt entirely ordinary. The city had changed during that time. Neighborhoods that once felt forgotten were thriving again. Families who had feared losing everything had stability. Children who once worried about moving away sat in the same classrooms they loved. Life had moved forward. So had I. At least that was what I told myself. The annual Community Education Gala occupied the same waterfront building where I had attended countless charity events over the years. String lights reflected across the river outside the windows while teachers, volunteers, donors, and families filled the room. I was helping one of my students adjust a crooked bow tie when I heard someone quietly say my name. Emily. My heart recognized the voice before my mind did. I turned slowly. Damien stood a few feet away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked different, not because of his suit or appearance. The change was harder to define. The sharp edges I remembered seemed softer somehow. The constant tension behind his eyes had disappeared. He looked lighter. Human. Real. Hello, Damien. A small smile appeared. Hello. The silence between us felt surprisingly comfortable. Not awkward. Not painful. Just honest. I heard the reading program expanded again, he said. It did. That is good. I nodded. I heard the housing initiative reached 3 more neighborhoods. His smile widened slightly. It did. Around us, conversations continued. Music drifted through the ballroom. Yet somehow the noise seemed distant. Like the rest of the room had faded away. You look well, he said quietly. So do you. For a moment, he glanced toward the river beyond. The windows. Thank you. I frowned slightly. For what? His eyes returned to mine. For teaching me something nobody else ever could. I felt my chest tighten. Damien took a slow breath. I spent most of my life believing success meant control. More money. More influence. More power. He shook his head gently. You were the first person who ever made me question that. I looked away briefly, suddenly overwhelmed by emotions I could not easily name. I was not very kind about it. You were honest. His voice remained calm. I needed that. The sincerity in those words made it impossible to look anywhere else. For a long moment, we simply stood there. 2 people who had traveled very different roads to arrive at the same place. Finally, Damien smiled. Not the confident smile of a powerful man. Not the polished smile people expected from him. Just a simple one. Genuine and unguarded. I should let you get back to your students. I nodded slowly. Probably. He hesitated for half a second, then stepped back. No requests. No expectations. No attempts to hold on to the moment. Just respect. Before turning away, he spoke one final time. I hope you are happy, Emily. I watched him for several seconds. Then I smiled. I am. And for the first time since we met, neither of us needed anything more. As he disappeared into the crowd, I realized something unexpected. The man who once seemed capable of owning everything had finally learned the value of letting go. And somehow, that was what made him worth finding again.